Brower. They just, in fact, came to our congregation and shared with us on marriage conversion, a marriage enrichment weekend. And we were so blessed by that. Several people came together and we just got some wonderful information, some of their story on their walk through marriage and making marriage better and marriage conversion. Timmy is a mental health counselor of 12 years. She's in private practice, and she mostly deals with trauma. And she may share a little bit more with us on that. And then Richie Brower is our youth and family ministries coordinator for the Upper Columbia Conference. So we are so thankful that they are here. Tonight they will share with us our extreme home makeover. It's really their story of bringing two stubborn people together and getting to the very brink of divorce before putting the brakes on and saying, hey, stop. Let us figure out how God is leading us and what it is that we need to do. So I am so thankful and so grateful that we have the Browers here that will share with us in regards to marriage and family life in this evening. I want to stop for just a moment and just have a word of prayer as we begin our program. Father, we thank you so much for your love. We thank you so much for your kindness. You are so good to us, and we love the fact that you have given us your word, Father, to deepen our walk with you, to help us to go deeper with you. And tonight, as we spend some time talking about family life and marriage, Lord, give us insight, give us understanding, give us the Spirit of God that will help us to move forward in those things that you are calling us to do. Thank you so much. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Well, hello, and we are excited to be here and share, and we've already had a chance to share with you some, but we're kind of picking up for where we went the other evening, and we're going to be sharing our story. And you might wonder, why are you sharing some of the things that you're sharing? Isn't this supposed to be something that's giving us tools? And I think that we've discovered that when we share our story, something powerful happens, because when people hear our story and the darkness that we come from, it helps people to realize just how big God is and what he can do. If he's big enough to reach us, then he can reach anyone.
And we don't tell this story because we come out looking particularly shiny in it.
No.
We share this story, as Richie said, because we really want people to know that they're not alone in their struggle, and that no matter where you are, God can reach into that place and can touch you and your spouse and can move you into a different place of belonging with each other and communion with God and each other.
So Timmy and I met at a summer camp not far from where we're speaking here tonight, and began to get to know each other there, working together at summer camp. And I finally proposed to Timmy aboard a 43-foot yacht moored on the Columbia River here in the Pacific Northwest, not far from Portland, Oregon. 9 months later, we were married in a picture-perfect outdoor setting, but that was just kind of the beginning. And the truth is, for us, our wedding was barely over, the honeymoon barely begun, when our marriage literally hit the rocks, and we ran into some serious complications and troubles. In fact, I remember one evening, we took our honeymoon to a beautiful island destination. I remember one evening, we're watching the sunset, sitting on the beach on this island, looking out across the ocean, Timmy on one end of the beach and Richie on the other. And that was kind of how things got started for us, and it went downhill from there, I think would be safe to say.
That would be safe to say. You know, we did our homework. We read books together. We did premarital counseling. We did all kinds of things. But there's something about being connected in marriage that shifted some of the conversations for us. And suddenly we found ourselves in some cycles of anger and withdrawal that left both of us deeply hurt, confused, feeling rejected, and not knowing where to turn in our challenges. Our first assignment as a married couple was Richie was pastoring at that point. I was still in my undergrad. And our first pastoral assignment was to a rural 3-church district. And we had wonderful, wonderful, honest folk that we got to work with. And we still are friends with many of them today. There are probably a few intuitive souls who realized and detected that something wasn't quite right in our relationship in our home, but for the most part, we had a very well-guarded ministry facade, because when you're the pastor's family, are you allowed to have issues? Are you allowed to have problems? Are you allowed to say, I have no idea how to make marriage work? We voted no on that. We did not have the option of saying any of those things. So even family members had no idea that we were struggling really, really deeply, and had been literally since our honeymoon.
And that struggle really, it really took on the look of cycles of anger and feelings of rejection and withdrawal, and it just kind of went through these cycles over and over again. And there'd be times when we'd come together and go through the photo albums. We have evidence. We had fun. There were good times in there, but there was a lot of hurt and anger and distance. And frankly, we didn't know where to go, who to talk to, what to do. We just thought this was how it was, and we just had to kind of muddle through. So it was a rough, I remember that first year, we talk about that year, we call that affectionately the year from hell, that first year of our marriage.
Not super affectionately.
No, it was not a great time.
Yeah.
So that was the first year, and then the first 3.5 years of our marriage, we were pastoring in that district and struggling deeply in our marriage, and you know, we might be put on our ministry facades outside of our home, but we'd come home and we were dealing with all of this stuff. So,
and what was tricky about that time period is we really didn't know that we could ask for help, or if we could, who we should ask for help, because we didn't come from a background where people talked about the real things of relationship, either one of us in our own families of origin. And so to even identify that this wasn't how it was supposed to be was a bit far from where we were, because we didn't know that this isn't how it was supposed to be.
So fast forward several years that we'd served in that first district, and we moved to a larger city to plant a brand new church. So when I say plant a brand new church, we're talking about starting a church from scratch that didn't exist. And now the full weight of responsibility rested on our family, and the pressure was definitely rising in our home. And that pressure, the pressure of ministry and trying to start something from scratch and all the responsibility that came with that, led to angry outbursts and tearful arguments at home. And it was during this season, as we were trying to launch this new church, that despair really began to clutch at my heart, as I began to wonder if things would be like this between the two of us forever. I thought, man, maybe this is it. And at times I even contemplated the possibility that our marriage might not survive. We had promised never to use the D word, as we called it. We'd said we'd never use that in our home, and I don't think we did. But it was during this season, and I thought, man, I don't know if we're going to make this. I don't know what that looks like.
And both Richie and I come from families that have been divorced, in some cases several times over.
Right.
So it was really important to us that we find a new way. We wanted to find a new path, but we had absolutely no idea even how to look for signposts on what that could be.
So we're in this cycle of crisis, and at the same time trying to gather a team and build a church. And so we may have been sunshine and laughter at church and outside of our home, but our home and our family was characterized by anger and hurt, criticism, and isolation. And I'm not going to brag about what I'm about to say, but Timmy and I, we just kind of tell it like it is. And if you don't know us, welcome to the club. But we just kind of tell it how it really went down. So as all this is going on, I just wanted Timmy to get fixed, because I just knew that things would be okay if she just buckled down and deal with her issues and really focus on her stuff. I just knew that things would be okay, and that was
what he said.
I did, and to be honest, you know, we're several years into our marriage at this point, and the trust wasn't really there between us. So I had some real questions as to whether or not she was really doing all that she could do to make our marriage work.
And Richie had identified me as the problem early on, and I actually agreed with him, so I can't completely put that onto him. And so since I was the identified problem, I went to counselors, because that's what you do when you have issues. You go to a counselor. And when that didn't work, we went to counselors, and we went to some really good ones that I would recommend. They were helpful, and we gained some really great tools, but we were never able to circle down and really get down to the root of what was going on with us. and what was causing our problems. So we would have seasons where things would get better, and I call those stints of good behavior. We had stints of good behavior, but it never lasted for more than a couple months. And then Richie's anger would start to rise again. I would do things that would frustrate him. And he wouldn't come at me violently, but I could feel the rage just churning inside of him. And my response to that, as we said before, is I would withdraw, and Richie would feel rejected, so he would pursue, and we would do this cycle until I hit my full line of what was happening, and then I would turn and attack, and then he would finally withdraw himself, and it was just a really bad cycle of emotional clashing and conflict all the time, and we never were able to break out of that for more than a few months at a time.
So during this time, as we're just kind of cycling and struggling, I picked up a book that challenged my thinking. Actually, a couple different books, and these books challenged me to consider that that things could be different. First book was a book on what it meant to be a godly man. And as I read the book, I realized I had no idea whatsoever what it meant to live as a godly man. I hadn't seen that in the home I grew up in. That just wasn't something that I had a clue about. And so I realized, man, I've got a lot to learn. And the other book was talking about what does it mean to have a personal, interactive relationship with Jesus Christ. And I had grown up in the church and gone to school and church school, but I'd missed some things. And I had missed this idea that God wanted to have a personal relationship with me. And so these new ideas are beginning to form in my head, and I'm trying to say, what does that mean, and how do I apply that? And yet we continue to struggle. And if anything, things got worse between us. And I remember one night we got into a fight. Who knows? We were probably fighting about real estate or something. That was something we fought about a lot at that point because we were looking for a home. And
we didn't agree on where to go because I wanted to be near civilization and Richie wanted to be in the wilderness. And civilization often isn't in the wilderness, and so he kept saying, let's go this way, and I kept saying, go this way, and it left us in a muddle, to put a very, very innocuous word into it most of the time.
A big muddle.
A very large muddle.
So I don't know if that was what we were fighting over for sure, but probably. And I remember that Timmy looked at me, tears streaming down her eyes, and she said, all these books you're reading and videos you're watching aren't making you any nicer. And I remember, now something you may not know about me is that back in those days, I had a compassion score of 0. I had taken a spiritual gifts inventory, and when they rated the spiritual gift of compassion, I got 0. And so I was operating out of that lack of gifting there and compassion. But I looked at Timmy when she said that, and I thought, I can imagine that it would be difficult to be her and realize that really the things we're struggling with in our marriage are her issues, and I can see why she'd want to probably kind of, push some of that responsibility and blame off onto me. But now, looking back, when I think about it, and I've had lots of audiences affirm that my thinking is clearer now than it was then, it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? That if God is getting a hold of us and God is changing us, the first person who will notice the change is going to be who? It's going to be the person we live closest to. And so her evaluation was actually spot on, but I wasn't ready to hear that yet. And so I just kept saying, well, no, it's all you, and we both know it's all you.
So at this point, we actually found a piece of property that we fell in love with. It had a little tiny bungalow on it. And when I say tiny, I'm saying like 574 square feet for 3 of us to live in. That was a literal tiny. And we decided we had a sabbatical coming up. What is the most restful, peaceful, bonding experience that we could possibly have on this 3-month sabbatical that we had? And after much prayer and contemplation, we decided to build a house with our own 2 hands, because that is a bonding experience. That is a low conflict type of an endeavor, and we thought that would be a great way to get rested and rejuvenated before we continue our church plant.
We're not always the sharpest knives in the drawer, but we meant well.
We're some of the most optimistic.
Yes,
but
we're very optimistic.
I wouldn't say we're super brilliant at times.
So we started building a house. Timmy drew the plans. She had this house all mapped out in her head. I mean, every little detail. She had it all laid out exactly how she wanted it.
I had every electrical outlet exactly where it needed to be so that Christmas trees never had to have a cord running to a wall. Everything was exactly detailed.
It was perfect.
It was perfect.
Yeah, she laid it all out. So we started building this house, and we were in the framing stage, so no roof yet, but the walls were up and the second floor was going on and getting ready to move to rafters and all that good stuff. And one day, we had just come out onto the job site, starting work, because we were building this house ourselves with our hands.
That was a literal us building the house.
Yeah, so actually Timmy and a framing nailer, she's pretty good with a big old framing nailer. She can do layout on stairs and electrical wiring and all kinds of important things.
Yes.
Yeah. So we're getting to work this particular morning, and as we're walking out to begin work for that day, my cell phone rings. And I answer the phone, and it's a friend of ours, Pastor Gary. And Pastor Gary says, "Hey, Richie, I'm on my way to camp meeting right now, and I don't have a lot of time to talk, but let me just get straight to the point." And so I walk away from the job site, and he starts talking, and as I'm walking, Pastor Gary says to me, "Richie, based on what I have seen of you and Timmy and what Timmy has been telling me, you are emotionally and spiritually abusive to your wife, and it has to stop." Well, no one had ever talked to me that way. I mean, I was the pastor. Nobody told me that I was abusive, and that got my attention, and I was listening, and I kept walking. And I remember on our property we had what we called split level property. So we had the upper level where we were building our house, and then it dropped down to the lower level where there was wetlands and trees, and there was some cliffs where you could sit at the top and look down into the forest down below. It was a gorgeous spot. And I walked over there and I sat down at the top of those cliffs, and he continued to talk. And fortunately, he didn't just drop that bomb and hang up and say, "Sorry, gotta go." He continued, and Pastor Gary said to me, "Richie, God's not done with you. God sees gold in you. But this can't continue. There has to be a change." And, I'd like to say that after having someone kind of smack me upside the head and talk to me that plainly, that I got it, and that was the beginning of a big turnaround in our marriage, but it wasn't. I will say that at the end of that conversation, I was probably prepared to admit that things were likely worse than I had thought before. But I still wasn't ready to take any responsibility that this was my issue or anything like that. And so we continued to slide downhill, as things continued to get worse between us.
We did. So we hit the end of our sabbatical, went back to our church and realized that we were in trouble at multiple levels. Our church plant was hemorrhaging, our marriage was hemorrhaging, and we had to find something soon to stop it because we couldn't continue the way we were. And so after much discussion and prayer, because in most relationships, and certainly true of ours, Richie has his issues, I have my issues, and then we have our issues. And so we decided that I was going to do some work on some of my issues, because the reason I was the identified problem over the years is I have early trauma, and it was evident in how it was working out in our marriage. And what we weren't identifying at that point is that Richie has early trauma as well. And so as you put us together, we were a perfect cocktail of conflict. But at that point, I was still the one who was the primary problem in at least his eyes, maybe ours. And so I decided I was going to do some counseling. So I went to a different place that does intensive counseling. And I left Richie, well, not leaving him, but I left him with Caleb, our son, our only son at that point, and was going to go work on counseling and see if I could kind of work on some of my own heart issues and come back better able to engage with Richie. But right before I left, we invited a couple over who had been friends of ours for a while, and just so they could pray for us and know what was going on and kind of help support us during this time.
And as we were visiting with those friends that evening, Timmy shared that she was going to be going away to do some intensive counseling, and we were asking them to pray for us. And his name is Jerry, he looked at me and he said, "Well, Richie, Timmy can go do all the counseling she wants." And he said, "And she should." He said, "But you are the key." And I hated him for that. Because what I heard him say was, "Richie, it's your fault." Well, I don't know where this came from, but I have a fault plate. It's a plate, and when that fault plate gets overloaded, then nothing else is allowed to be my fault. And I was pretty sure that our church plant collapse was my fault, and so nothing else was allowed to be my fault. And so when he says, "Richie, you're the key," I hear him say, "It's your fault," and I'm just like, "No, it's not. Nope. And I just tuned him out and went, la, 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 la. And so he said those words, and he said a little more. He said, "If at any point you would like to get together, Richie, and talk about some of these issues with another man, I'd be happy to do that with you." And I'm thinking, yeah, you're the last man on earth that I want to talk about, you jerk. And I quickly tuned him out.
But while I was gone, I was working on the issues I went there for. Richie came and joined me for part of the time, and the whole thing was pretty much a train wreck, actually. It did not bring us closer together at all. And so as I spent a few more days after Richie left, and I was thinking and I was praying, and it just hit me, we can't continue like this. We can't continue like this forever, because nothing that we've done so far has made any lasting change. And so I called Richie and said, "Hey, I'm scheduled to come home in a couple days, and I will come as soon as you have accountability." And I said, "It doesn't have to be a counselor, but you have to. I already have an accountability group that I'm meeting with weekly, and I need you to have accountability too. And I'm not going to come home until you tell me what you've done to make it happen, because we can't keep doing what we're doing and calling it love. It isn't. I won't call it that anymore, and I so deeply want to give more to our son than what we've been modeling so far."
So you had been doing accountability for how long? Because you've been doing this for a while.
Oh, it was probably at least 4 years at that point, weekly.
And we talked about, Maybe Richie, you should try this too. And my response was, yeah, I'm good. Yeah,
Well, and I remember some of the things you said was, "No, God and I have this. I don't need other people."
Yeah, really, that'd just be an inconvenience. And who wants to, share all those things with somebody else?
And it's none of their business.
Yeah, really, absolutely, none of their business at all. So, but now things have changed, right? Because now she's kind of putting a relational gun to my head and saying, "Hey, I'm not coming home until you have accountability." And I was highly motivated for her to come home, because our church plant was struggling big time. It was going down in flames. I had a very young child, 18, 20 months, little guy, and I was highly motivated to have some help taking care of him while I was trying to deal with what was going on at church. And I really, really, really wanted you to come home. Well, so I'm thinking accountability, and I'm racking my brain going through all the options that I could choose from of people that I could, open up and share what was really going on in my home. And the only person who'd offered to talk with me about this kind of stuff was that jerk who'd said that it was my responsibility, that I was the key. And I didn't want to talk to him, but I really, really, really wanted you to come home. And so, in that moment of desperation, I realized that was the only option I had. I'm sure I must have sounded really enthusiastic when I picked up the phone and called Jerry and said, "Hey, you kind of offer that maybe we get together and talk now and then. I think that'd be a good thing. Timmy'd really like me to do that." And so we set an appointment. I called Timmy and said, "Okay, I've got an appointment. I'm going to meet with Jerry. You can come home." And
in just about that intonation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it was just about this time, 10 years ago? Right about this
11
time.
Years
actually,
ago.
11 years ago, that I met you at the airport, and we kind of looked into each other's eyes and thought, "I wonder if this is going to work." and I started meeting with Jerry.
It's true. So while I was away, it became apparent that our little church plant was not going to continue, survive as it had. So shortly after I came home, Richie and I talked and we prayed, and we felt like God was leading us to step aside as a pastoral couple for our church plant. And so we met with the administration within our denomination and talked about what the different options could be. And our president, said that we could go, there's other churches available, and here's the ones that are open. And we talked through the options as they were, but the one commonality in all of the options that he was laying out for us is all of them were going to take us out of the greater Spokane area. And at that point, we had really buckled down on working on our marriage. I was meeting with my accountability group, Richie was meeting with Jerry, and we had a marriage mentor couple that was meeting with us as well on an every other week basis for like 3 or 4 hours when we met with them. Yep. And so we had kind of created this whole community around our marriage, and we were faced with the choice of either moving but maintaining direct deposit and health benefits, which I'm really keen on both of those things, or staying put and having the resources that we needed to really keep putting our marriage back together again, because we finally were dancing with hope in a way that we hadn't been before. We had a team around us, and I don't think we named it that way at the time, but looking back, it was like our marriage was in ICU. Yeah. And when someone is in ICU, you have a very high provider to patient ratio, and you keep it that way because that's the level of need that the patient has to maintain life. And that's how we felt our marriage was, is that we needed a very high level of care to us ratio if we were going to change the patterns that both of us came from with divorce. And so
how many hours a week would you say we were spending between us at that point?
I would say collectively we were spending at least 10 hours a week between our various marriage mentor couples, your accountability, my accountability, and that was actually us going out and seeking resources, and then whatever we were talking about, all those resources would be on top of that 10 hours. We took it really seriously that we were not going to survive if we didn't put all of our energy into saving our marriage. And we've had a lot of different people ask us, so what was that? Why did you do that? Why didn't both of you just walk away? It wasn't like you were having any fun, which is a true statement. We were not having any fun at that point. And, I think both of us really just settled into no, we are not gonna do it like that. And there's some perks to stubbornness. And so I think we had kind of a spirit-led resistance that we are not gonna quit, period, ever. And so we both buckled down. But here we are faced with a decision. What are we gonna do? Are we going to have a job, or are we gonna have support for our marriage? And after praying about it a lot, we decided that what was most important was our marriage. So we said thank you to our denomination, and we stepped out over and into an abyss.
Yes, we did.
Yes, that is what we did.
So during this time, I start meeting with Jerry once a week, and for about 10 years time, Jerry and I call him Jerry the Jerk, because he always put me in tough spots and held my feet to the fire.
How did he do that?
Oh, in lots and lots of ways. But we met for, and we'll come back to some of those, but we met for 2 to 3 hours every week for about 10 years. When we have a chance to talk to people, we say, how many of you ladies even knew that 2 guys could talk for 2 to 3 hours, just the 2 of them? And that's a shock to some, to many even. But our agenda over that 10 years for those talks, all that time that we spent, hundreds and hundreds of hours, our agenda never changed. The stories changed dramatically and wildly over the course of time, but the agenda never changed. There was 2 items on our agenda. Number 1, how to be a godly man. And number 2, how to love our wives well. That's what we talked about every week for 10 years' time. And I would come in, I remember, Timmy would be terrible. I was sure I had her this time. She'd done something awful, and I'd come in, and I got this terrible story. You wouldn't believe what she did. She said these things. I can't believe it. Here I am trying so hard. And he'd look at me and say, so Richie, what would Jesus have done in response to Timmy in that situation? Richie, what did Timmy need from you in that situation? And so I'd go in to meet with Jerry the jerk, and I'd just be sure he was finally going to agree with me that she was just rotten and she needed to straighten up. And I'd walk out of his office 2 or 3 hours later, and I'd go home, and I'd apologize again because I began to see. I began to see some things differently.
So as things started to shift, Richie was being kinder, and he wasn't, when we were starting to get in a discussion that was difficult, instead of reacting with anger, which is what I was used to, he would pause and he would go, I need to pray about that. Can we come back to this conversation in half an hour? And he would step away, and he would usually go outside and walk and pray and probably rant just a little. And then he'd come in, and we would re-engage the conversation. So things started to shift, and I could feel the shift inside of me, but it was also kind of scary because what I didn't know was how long it was going to last. And we'd had stints of good behavior before, and it's once you have experienced hope and that it might be different, to sit in that in-between space of things are going better, but you have just a literal, visceral sense that it will change, so you might as well get the waiting period over with. Sitting with that is hard, and so I did what many women that I have now found out do. You bring up every difficult topic that you've ever had in your marriage, and you do it in quick succession so that if it's only a stint of good behavior, it's going to get done, and you can move on and get back into the normal cycle of conflict that you're used to. And so I brought up things like finances. Ooh. That's a hard one, occasionally. And for us, a big one was who owns time. Because when you have a child, someone has to make sure that child is not hurting themselves or others or burning down your house. And so you have to, someone always has to be watching that child. So if there is a break and neither one of you have something you have to be doing in that 2-hour stretch, who owns time and gets to decide who's going to watch the baby? And that had been a huge issue in our marriage over the years. And so I brought it up. Let's see, how's it going to go? And I could see his hackle start to rise. And honestly, I would start to calm. It was like, oh, I know this cycle. This is the anger conflict cycle. We've done this a bazillion times. And then he would stop and he would go, Let's just pause this conversation. Let's come back to it. And that actually raised my anxiety because I'm like, now this I'm not used to, and I don't like it, and it makes me very uncomfortable. And so we started this new dance of him not responding the way I was used to, and so I had to then adjust, and then he had to adjust, and it started, we were always off step for a little while, but we were off step towards hope, disruption towards hope, rather than towards death.
So as we're moving through this journey, and Jerry and I are meeting and talking, and I'd come into all these stories, he was patient but firm. So one thing I may or may not have said about Jerry is Jerry's retired Air Force. So there's a certain intensity of the man, and he just kind of looks at you, and it's like he sees right through you. In fact, for years he made Timmy nervous because she was pretty sure he did see through her.
Yeah.
But he was
exactly what you needed.
He was exactly what I needed. God knew that I needed somebody that wouldn't take any flack, and he did not let me wiggle. But as we talked, he and we processed, I began to see. Things started to get clearer in my mind. And I remember that Jerry challenged me to begin praying a couple of different prayers. One was really pretty radical for me. I began to ask God to change me instead of asking him to change Timmy, which is what I'd been praying for years, for our entire marriage. Oh, God, help her, help Timmy. And I began to say, God, help me. And then I began to ask God, teach me how to love Timmy well. And those are prayers that God is eager to answer. And as I began to pray, God, teach me to love Timmy well, he began to change how I related to her and how I would interact with her and how I thought about her. And something began to happen. And as God began to change my heart, a miracle began to take place in our marriage. And I began learning to listen to the voice of God speaking to me and sharing with me and teaching me how to interact with Timmy. One of the things that I had learned was how to really listen to Timmy when she talked. And actually, I could listen okay. When Timmy, when you would talk about, other people who had done things that hurt you, or, your family or my family or whatever, things out there, I could handle that just fine. But when you started talking about things I did that maybe hurt you or affected you negatively, I would literally fall asleep.
I remember.
Remember that fault plate? We talked about that fault plate? My fault plate would just instantly fill up, and I would fall asleep. I fell asleep in Taco Bell one time.
I also remember.
It's true. It was embarrassing, but it was true. And so Timmy started saying some things to me and give me a little feedback about how she felt about my sleeping. And what was that feedback like?
That I felt completely abandoned and rejected and not valuable to you at all, insignificant, like you cared about most other things more than me. You would never do that at your work because you would lose your job. I think I had quite a few things to say.
Yeah. So I remember one day I went into my weekly appointment with Jerry and I said, Jerry, what do I do? I keep falling asleep. When Timmy starts sharing, I just fall asleep. And I don't know what to do. And he looked at me, and he's very serious and sober faced, and he said, stand up. I'm like, oh, because see what had been happening a lot of times, we'd climb into bed, be the end of a long day, I'd be tired, and we'd be talking, and the bed would be getting warm, and then Timmy would turn to me and begin to pour out her heart. And what I heard was something like this. It went, honey, and I was out. And she was offended. And so Jerry said, hey, stand up. And I'm like, okay, I can do that. Well, the only problem was we were living in this 574 square foot bungalow, and our bed was in the loft, and the ceiling was slanted above our bed, and it wasn't very high. And so I remember the first night we're laying there in bed, and Jared gave me this good wisdom, and I'm ready to try it out, and you start to open up and share something. I have no idea what it was. Sorry, it's a long time ago. But
I don't either. I'm not hurt.
But I found myself falling asleep, and I may have found myself something like this, boom, because sometimes she had ways of waking me back up. And
sometimes I was aware you were falling asleep and you weren't.
Often, yes. And so she'd realize that I'm nodding off, and all of a sudden I'm getting signals that I'm going to sleep on her again. And so I'm like, oh, wait, I know what to do. And so I jump up, and this is literally how it went. I jump out of bed, and I stand over the bed like this, because I had to kind of go like this, because the ceiling was right there. And so I stand over the bed, and I say, okay, honey, I'm listening.
And then we both laughed, and then we continued the conversation, because I actually really did want to share some things.
You did, yes. Mm-hmm. But I'm learning to listen.
Yep.
And that was a big skill. A couple other things that I started to learn. I began to learn how to play. I like to work. I enjoy work. I like all kinds of work, and most of my recreation, just different kinds of work. But I had boys, and they like to play. And so I began learning how to play, and we'd go out and do really exciting things like taking fistfuls of dirt and throwing them up in the air, because you know what? When you're little, when you're 2 and 3 and 4, that's pretty cool stuff. And so I began learning to play. I will never be the most fun play person. That's just not how I'm wired, but I began learning how to play.
Well, in a lot of ways, that really showed me that something was shifting in you, that you started to be able to play more. Because before, you couldn't even wrap your brain around, I mean, there's no purpose to play, there's no outcome to play. And to watch you be able to play and engage with our children in a very young and innocent way really said that there was things that were shifting inside of you, and you were measuring and weighing things in your own heart in a different way than you had been before. Yep. And I know another thing that really impacted me was during that time is we were doing dishes one night, and I was washing, you were drying, and you turned to me and you said, you know, when I do these things, I can't imagine what the effect on you must have been. Would you tell me? And I remember looking at you like you must have grown 3 heads, because that is not the man I married who invites a conversation around his failure. And so I started just kind of sharing, well, you know, this was the impact on me, and this is what it was like from my heart. And you didn't get defensive. You actually responded with a, honey, this is not the man I want to be. And by God's grace, I'm going to keep changing, because I don't want to be the man that treats you that way, that interacts with you that way. And as things continued to change, I found myself a little bit in a unique position, because I wasn't sure how to relate to you in that. I remember driving to my small group one night, and these two women had supported me through the highs and the lows of everything for about, at that point, maybe 6 years, 7 years. And so I was driving going, what am I going to talk about tonight? Because my identity had kind of been around being married to a difficult man. And so, you know, what am I going to talk about? Because as I was realizing, I'm like, he's actually not that difficult most of the time. And when he is difficult, we know what to do about it. And when I'm difficult, we know what to do about it. And so it's like we weren't in the same relational space. And I remember as I was driving going, well, what am I going to talk about? I mean, who am I if my identity is not combined with being married to a difficult man in a painful marriage? And I remember that night as I was driving, just feeling like God was saying to me, you can let go of that. You can let him out of that. And going, whew, but I don't know what that means. I don't know. I mean, yeah, the whole identity thing. Who am I if I'm not in relation to that? And I remember going to my girls and saying, you know, God and I kind of had a conversation in the Jeep on the way here. And I'm not sure what to talk about, because my marriage isn't what it was. I don't know what it is, but it wasn't that. And so will you help me as I go into this new uncharted territory? And it was scary, but it was really good.
You know, that night, you made a choice to release me from my identity as the angry, abusive husband. Mm-hmm. And I can never thank you enough for that, because frankly, I'd done enough that you could have justifiably held me in that identity forever. And you gave me an incredible gift. You gave me the freedom to become something new that neither of us knew what that would be.
We didn't know what we were doing at that point.
We had no idea where that was going, but that was an incredible gift and a gift of faith, I think, on your part. And I thank you for that. So Timmy talks about her identity being the spouse of an angry man. My identity, like most men, had been tied up in my career. So think about it, guys. When two guys meet for the first time, we get together, we look at each other, we exchange names. Hi, I'm Richie, and you are. And the second question we ask is what? So what do you do, right? That's what we ask. That's what we follow up with. And so now we've stepped off the cliff. I don't have a career. We're trying to figure out what we're doing. We decided that, you know, a great choice for replacing my income was to start an organic farm from scratch. You know, never done it before.
From a pasture,
From
actually.
a pasture. Mm-hmm. And so we had started this amazing little program, and we were feeding the deer very well with organic produce. Mm-hmm. They were appreciative.
We probably would have made more money if we would have shot them and sold our organic venison.
Undoubtedly. Mm-hmm. And so what we were doing, God had a plan in that farming, that agricultural endeavor. It was good therapy.
It was.
For both of us.
It wasn't lucrative, but it certainly got us on our knees together in the dirt a lot, so that counts for something.
Yep. And so here we are, you know, time's carrying on, the finances are constricting, the pressure's coming up, and you know, up until now, I'd been the provider of my family. That was my identity. And now I had no career, no means to provide for my family, and the pressure's growing, and the pressure inside of me is growing, and I found myself wrestling with God. I'd go for a walk down that driveway on that property that we'd found, and I'd look up into heaven and say, God, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to learn? I'm listening. I'm paying attention. You have my attention. What is it? What do you want me to do? And God kept impressing me through the Holy Spirit that that my job was to continue to focus my attention on pursuing my wife's heart. That was my assignment. That was my goal, my role, my career for that season of life. And so more than a job, more than all the things that seemed to make sense that we needed, God said, nope, I need you to learn to be a man who loves Timmy well. That was what I was doing.
And it wasn't that you weren't looking for a job. I mean, you exhausted all kinds of opportunities looking for jobs, and you took odd jobs. And it wasn't like you were just sitting on the couch going, I'm just going to learn to love well, and that's my only task. I mean, we were both still really active in financially supporting our family during that time as well.
Yeah, and I'd applied for all kinds of jobs. I even applied to be the guy who fills the candy vending machines. We got no's or no feedback at all. Reached out to different ministry contacts that we had and said, hey, looking for something, what can I do? And silence, just crickets the whole time.
It kind of felt like God put us in timeout. And I mean, in discipline with our children in the ideal world, is we put them in circumstances so they learn from what they've done so they won't do it again. And I wouldn't say it works super well with our children, but I would say that a timeout of several years for us actually we did look at where we had been and where we were going and what needed to shift so we didn't continue on the road and the path we had been on.
And there came a time, I couldn't even give you an exact timeline, how long it was, but there came a time when we looked at each other and went, we're not where we used to be.
Yep.
And we haven't been that for quite some time. This isn't just another 1 or 2 month stint of good behavior. Something has foundationally changed in our marriage. This is different. This is new territory. And we began to realize, wow, God has done something awesome here in our home. Now, don't get us wrong. We're not standing up here saying, hey, we've never had a challenge since.
Because that would be lying, and
we could say that. We could say, we haven't had a challenge since like 3 hours ago today.
That's probably about right.
But no, we're human. We're living in a sinful world, and so we struggle because we still have the same history that we had. We still have the same past, both of us, and we deal with those things. But something has changed. God has done something in me and in you that began to change the dynamics of our home and how our home functioned.
Yeah, and some of the reason why we share some of our past story is because at least Richie always had the idea that to heal, you had to have this peaceful time of quiet reflection, and that's what it meant to be able to come closer to God and be able to heal. And that was not our story. We did not get a quiet cabin.
Although I still think that sounds pretty good.
I actually would sign up right now if it were one of my choices. But, for us, we lived in the midst of tremendous financial pressure, relational pressure. We had 2 babies in addition to our baby during this time. And so we really, we struggled. And one of the things that was really helpful in experiencing Richie and all this chaos is to know that it wasn't just a stint of good behavior. The other thing that was really helpful during this time was that we heard real stories from real people who didn't have bows on the top. Because often in ministry, especially in a churchy type environment, we want to hear, or the stories that are told are the stories that have a bow. Well, back then, 1,500 years ago, then that's the bad stuff, but it's been really great since then. So to be able to tell really true stories in the here and now actually gives more power to Jesus instead of less.
Well, sometimes we think that if we're in ministry, if we're going to go out and reach the world, that we have to have perfect stories.
We have to be shiny and tidy.
Yeah, and we are often, and this is one of the devil's tools. The devil says, if people knew who you really were, they'd never listen to you. You would lose your credibility, you'd lose your ministry, you'd lose it all. And we found that quite the opposite. And actually, as we've studied Scripture and other inspired sources, we have found that the opposite is true. It's actually our stories that equip us for ministry. Because, listen, do you want to take advice from somebody who has an unreal life? No. If they haven't been there, done that, then what do they have to offer? And so we were blessed by our mentors being willing to share their own stories of failure. And so we are willing to come up and share and say, you know what? we've been messed up. We are messed up. That's the truth, right?
We're healing, but still messed up.
We are messed up on a much better trajectory than we were on for so many years.
That's a good
and yet
word.
the reality is that as you look at us, you're not looking at two shining examples of awesome humanity. You're looking at two broken people who've met a Redeemer who knows how to redeem broken stories and use them to do miraculous things in the world.
It's true. You know, it says in Revelation that the saints overcame the dragon by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimonies. And we all know the blood of the Lamb. That's Jesus. That's the good news. That's the gospel. That's Calvary. But what we often neglect is that there is power in our testimonies. The word of our testimonies is, this is where I was, this is where Jesus found me, and here's where we are now. And in that, it reminds us that God is a big God, and he's brought us so very far. And it raises that hope, because if he's brought us that far, he will continue to do the good work that he has started. He's promised that in his word. And so we can rest, and when we tell our stories, we're reminded of that. Sometimes, you know, often we are very blessed by being able to share our testimony, because we forget how awful we were sometimes. Not too often, but occasionally. We forget how awful we were. So to be able to be reminded that we were awful, and we know how to not be awful now. Now it's more of a choice. And so now we get to have choices in what we do. We get to be reminded that God is so big and he's so powerful. And when we share that story and these stories with other people, they get to know that where they're living is not utter darkness without hope.
Yep, absolutely. You know, Joseph, when he was looking at his brothers, their father had passed away, they're all in Egypt, and now his brothers are terrified, right? The Bible account says that his brothers are terrified because they believe that now Joseph is finally going to take revenge because Jacob is dead. And instead, Joseph calls his brothers together, and he looks them in the eye, and he can see the fear in their eyes of wondering what's coming next. Are we all going to die today? And he says, no, 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 no. Listen, what you intended for evil, God intended for good and for the saving of many souls. And so as we look at our stories, the reason we tell our stories is because this is our opportunity to look at hell itself and say to Satan, you know what? You intended to destroy us, but what you intended for our destruction, God intended for good and for the salvation of many souls. And so we're willing to tell our story. I don't mind standing up here and looking horrible, because guess what? That's the truth. So it's worth it, because over and over, as we tell our story of darkness and where God has brought us from, people come up to us and say, thank you so much. That gives me so much hope. Yep. And it's not because we're standing here and saying, hey, it's all perfect in the Brower house. Just come on over and take a look. We'll show you how it's really done. No.
Actually, all you'd have to do is ask our children. They could tell you the true story of what it means to not be perfect in the Brower home.
That's right. No. So what does it mean today? What is our lack of imperfection? What does that look like? How is that different from what it was 11 years ago?
I think it's several things. I think one of the things is that we have to talk a lot, because we keep short accounts now. And so when things come up, we address them quickly. It's interesting that you asked me that question, so you don't have to answer it. Sneaky. I think it also means that we ask for help so much sooner than we used to. We used to wait until we truly thought we were going to die or kill each other. And now we have people, and we ask them for input, so we never get to that place of crisis anymore. I think the other thing is we've become experts on forgiveness, because we do act better, but we still hurt each other. And so our willingness to re-engage and both be humble and ask the other for forgiveness, I think those are some of the big different trajectories that have shifted from 11 years ago.
I think the other thing, I mean, you kind of alluded to it, but we've made a commitment that we don't want to stop growing.
It's true.
And so for us, that means that we continue going to counseling. That's a commitment we've made. We go a couple times a month. We've got an amazing Christian counselor that we love, And we keep growing and learning. And we don't ever want to stop, because every time we come to the end of a year, we want to look back and say, it's better this year than it was last year. And we want to keep growing through those bumps and hurdles. And so that's just a commitment we've made. And in fact, if we're going to stand up and teach and share, for us, there's a certain issue of integrity that we have to be continuing to grow ourselves. So that is part of the commitment that we have made, and that's part of what it looks like. So as we think about what it means to minister to our communities, to reach out and to serve families that may be hurting and challenging, part of it is being willing to share our own story, to actually, first of all, face our own story, enter our own story, and allow God to enter that story with us to bring healing, so that then we have a testimony that's real and current. Don't get sucked into telling the stories that are 15 years old, but real and current, that we can share with the people that we interact with.
Mm-hmm. So thank you for listening to our story and blessing us with that.
We'd like to close with prayer. God in heaven, thank you so much for this time that we've had to share, to be together. And Lord, I just ask right now that wherever folks are listening to and hearing our story, that you will touch their hearts right now, that you will bring hope and courage and determination. For those who maybe are hanging on the edge, that you will give them the courage to say, nope, I am going to plant a flag and say, darkness does not win here. We are going to fight for this marriage. We're going to fight for this relationship to be all that God intended. So thank you for what you've done for us. And God, we tell the story because what you've done for us, you are fully able to do for others as well. Thank you for your watch over our home and for the miracles you've wrought on our behalf. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.